You can see from this particular picture that respiratory support is usually done in collaboration with nursing and respiratory. Some hospitals will require people to go through respiratory to get a flutter valve, which is the device up in the right top corner. If you've not seen that, you can watch the video and it shows how that's used. The video also shows the nurse teaching what's called a diaphragmatic cough, which is an element you can teach patients and families to work on together to kind of optimize the opening and keeping the airways as open as possible to prevent atelectasis. And a really simple thing to do, and probably one of the best actions, is before going home, make sure that you teach the patient how to use an incentive spirometry and encourage them while they're awake at home to take that home with them and use that every 1 to 2 hours, and just kind of get used to that as a normal process for keeping their airway as open as possible, because you have a huge goal in terms of keeping that oxygenation and airway clearance optimal, and also preventing pneumonia that can come from lack of lung expansion properly. For patients that are on a ventilator, you will see respiratory and nursing kind of together work on pulmonary hygiene and suctioning when needed to keep the airway open as possible. You'll learn more about all that in critical care, so you don't have to commit this to memory, but just kind of see that there are some key elements here to preventing ventilator-associated pneumonia. That's a standard by Joint Commission in the hospitals, just very much like you would have CAUTI for prevention of urinary tract infections. They have the same thing in the ICU for prevention of ventilator pneumonias and infections. Again, we've already talked about some of that about oxygenation. Patients, again, may have endotracheal or tracheostomy care that needs to be done, and you would want to familiarize yourself with those steps. And then it comes down to other safety precautions about keeping the airway intact. And, you know, sometimes that requires chemical restraint or sedation. Sometimes that also might involve physical restraints. But as you can see in this patient picture here, this patient is completely cooperative. At some point when a patient's cognition is improved after these after these events, or their condition stabilizes, we can't leave these people in restraints forever. So this is something that often gets overlooked. So the idea is really try to find out when can those really come off, when can we stop sedating them as much, because they're going to do better with their respiratory situation if they can move more without physical restraints, and they're more alert to assist in the breathing process. So key things to pay attention to and try to push for. This just shows a splint in the picture. Patients like this often can develop contractures, so they are often fitted for specific splints that will work to kind of create some level of weight bearing for them on their joints and thus prevent contractures. They'll nearly always have a rotational schedule of how many hours on and off. You as the nurse need to really follow that carefully, because sometimes aides will be assigned to do that function and may not get time to. So you need to really watch behind that process. Obviously, if you have one on for too long, there's the risk of the area becoming sweaty, macerated, a big ground for creating a pressure ulcer. If it doesn't get put on for the time periods that it should be, then you're not really accomplishing the goal. Most of these patients are going to be in the hospital setting on SCDs to prevent blood clots, as well as some type of low molecular weight heparin. And teaching about that's important to the family so that they know what to look for with that as well. Some of these patients may be on antispasmodics, so you want to look for that. How well is that working, and does that need to be adjusted anyway? Nutritional support. Timely support while on the ventilator is really important. It's very common when somebody gets intubated that you're focused on the respiratory part, but not thinking about nutritionally what they might need. So sometimes the delay time period is a long time before they might get a nasogastric or a G-tube placed. And so really trying to watch for that so that gets done early is important. It's good to work with physical therapy and occupational therapy to get patients out of bed collaboratively, do some types of resistance exercise because that's going to promote bone health. And when you look at it from a nutrition standpoint, you may see patients that are getting nasogastric tube feedings that are different kinds of concentrations related to protein, as long as their kidneys can handle a higher level of protein, because that is done to kind of combat the problem that may come related to skin breakdown because of way low protein levels in their body. And then again, last of all, really looking at allowing them to really do as much self-management as they possibly can. Again, if they've got use of their arms, how do you strengthen the use of their arms so that they can do more things than what they have been able to thus far for themselves? This is just a slide that kind of reemphasizes bowel and bladder care. You see at the top is a picture of a bladder scanner, which of course is great for really evaluating any retention issues, and that could be retention before or after catheterization if it's needed, and to make sure that they're really emptying out well. If they are doing self-catheterizations, to make sure they're really doing it adequately. And then some patients may go home on these very smaller self-cath, and teaching people to do those is not the easiest, but many patients learn how to do that for themselves that are paraplegic, and then that takes care of, and it's even though it's being done more frequently, it's less invasive than leaving a catheter in for a long period of time. And the lowest picture you see is a picture of a suprapubic catheter, and that's one that's surgically placed directly through the abdomen into the bladder, and those are tend to be less likely to cause infections than ones that are through the urinary meatus. Of course, in all cases, we need to be really monitoring patients for UTIs. They need to be taught at home, family members most often, because the patients don't feel the pain. They may or may not be close enough to the bag to know if there's malodor or, issues going on. So families need to know that, and they need to know to watch their temperature for signs of that as well. Key elements for the bowel in terms of keeping it in good shape. These patients will often be put on stool softeners, a high fiber diet with an increased amount of fluid, and that should say fluid intake, not intact. Consistent time for elimination every day to kind of get in a routine pattern for attempting that is essential as well. And again, if they need to have disimpaction or a digital stimulation to check the situation or to see if that will get them started, if they're doing that at home, then they can be trained how to do that. If a nurse is doing that, again, we need to have a MD order. And enemas, although they are sometimes ordered, they are only really given if totally necessary. So that should be a last-ditch effort and not something that's routinely ordered. Bigger problems is adapting to the significant life change, and the huge psychosocial assessment needs to be done to see how they're going to adjust to disability, how will they go on from this part in their life. Case managers and discharge planners really have got to get involved. As you saw with the ALS video that we watched, you know, there's so many hoops to go through in terms of insurance, financial, how to plan for all this type of care and support that is needing if you're going to try to take someone home. And sometimes you just cannot afford parts of the care, and so there are some other support entities, depending on which disease it is, that you can get some help from. And so a good case manager is going to look at all of that and make sure that people get counseling to promote sexual health and any other kinds of support that can be rendered in preparation for them going home. And often that's going to take quite some time to get arranged, as I said in class. So last of all, this just shows you some of the things that may require adapting. You know, they may need to have a different kind of home ventilator at home that looks different than what they would have in a hospital setting. They will likely have to have their home evaluated in terms of amperage use and circuitry and kind of the load that it can carry, along with set up with a generator that is an automatic generator that cuts on should the power go out to help support that. They may need specialty wheelchairs that are easier for them to manipulate. Depending on the level of the injury, the wheelchair could be electric. It could have other features that allows a caregiver to help them stand for bearing weight, to help with bone health, and different things that would help. In the home setting, for those that are going to be a little more independent, perhaps as a paraplegic, you know, what is the height and is the things that they can gain access to ultimately set up in a way that they can manage. And some of that really takes a home assessment by somebody to kind of go in and look at that. Some of these patients, just because they're paraplegic doesn't mean that they can't drive. And I know that if you go to Greensboro and you try to get a van fitted, many times just the van refitting, not the van itself, can cost $30,000 to $40,000. So it's not cheap. Some people have to have fundraisers to have that happen. So it's a big undertaking to kind of work with. While the things are out there to help you adapt and have the best quality of life that you would like, the funding sources for all these things are not always available. And that's what sometimes really leads to the more helplessness, social isolation, and, you know, the feelings of not feeling like it's worth it to live. And so just knowing what there is out there in the community and getting those kind of things set up early when they're feasible for someone is just absolutely essential to that adjustment period. And you can look at the prices there. This was a couple years ago when I did this, but just a basic wheelchair with a headrest was $620. The one that really helps with the bone and ability to stand and maneuver well, $8,400. So big difference. And so we just need to try to educate people and find them the best help that we can. If you have any questions about this after you listen to the rest of this, please feel free to email me as always. Thank you.